Ubisoft, Naughty Dog, and Kojima Productions. These three produce the most realistic games of recent days. Time and time again, huge AAA game developers put graphics at the forefront of their marketing. But why? Why is graphics important in video games, and why do we strive for realism in games? Let me preface this by saying that I believe games are a work of art. It's a collaboration between different practices which includes music, visual arts, and as of recently, theater. With that being said, I'll treat it as such. Plato once said that art is an imitation of life. Taking this into consideration, we can now ask, are games imitating life? I know that asking it this way is unfair and dismissive of other theories of art, but let's entertain the thought for a second. Paintings throughout history have gone through movements. You've probably tackled this in art classes, but let me jog your memory for a little bit. An art movement is defined as a tendency or a style of art with a particularly specified objective and philosophy that is adopted and followed by a group. This basically means that most artists during that movement painted the same way. An example of this are the Renaissance painters and the first use of proper proportions, Baroque painters and their mastery of the chiaroscuro, as well as the dreamy movement of Impressionism. I'm mentioning these art movements as the contrast between Romanticism, which is more grounded in reality, and Impressionism is stark. How is it that in 100 years, artists seem to forget all of the things that they learned about painting? Well, it's because they started looking deep inside of them instead of just painting what's in front of them. Impressionism is the first art movement to be influenced by the invention of the camera. Painters before were hired to paint portraits and sceneries and usually keep things as close to reality as possible. However, when the camera was invented, portraits can now be done in one sitting and it captures everything accurately. This meant that painters were now slowly losing jobs that they once had due to a technological marvel, so they had to reinvent themselves. The path that they found was Impressionism, which involved going outside and painting what's in front of you. Because of the way Impressionists have painted, which included subjectivity and movement in their art, it also introduced something that we're very familiar with: abstraction. And believe it or not, this might just happen in video games. With all of that being said, we go back to the original question. Why are we striving for realism in video games? Here's the thing, I don't know. An argument could be made that developers are trying to achieve realism for better immersion. But what happens after that? If developers take achieving realism in games in the same way artists took to the invention of the camera, are we going to see abstraction in video games? In my opinion, we're already experiencing abstraction in games. Games like Plug and Play as well as Kids are games that I would consider abstract in terms of how they are played. In both of these games, the player isn't privy to the information as to why they are doing what they are doing, unlike in other RPG games where you're trying to save the world because if you don't, the world will cease to exist. Plug and Play, for example, requires the player to really pay attention to get what the developers are trying to say. In fact, the initial reaction of players was confusion. It's just so far from the traditional gameplay we're all used to. That is what makes it an abstract game in my eyes. As you may have noticed, games are also going through the same movements that art went through. However, the biggest difference between them is that video games are going through it all at the same time. On the one hand, we have developers pushing the current technology to achieve the most realistic graphics possible, and on the other hand, we have developers who are doing their best with what they have to convey their messages. And this brings me back to my original question. Why are we striving for realism in games?